I take refuge in the Buddha. I take refuge in the Dharma. I take refuge in the Sangha. Welcome, everybody. Thursday nights we've been looking at the life story of the Buddha as told through the Pali Canon, working with this book, The Life of the Buddha by Bhikkhu Nanamoli. And today I'd like to share with you a story that comes from roughly, it's the end of the first 20 years of the Buddhist teaching after his enlightenment. And it's the story of his interaction with a notorious murderer and robber named Angulimala. So that name means a necklace of fingers. Mala, right? The necklace. It comes because this murderer and robber who was terrorizing the countryside where the Buddha was staying took trophies from those that he murdered. He cut off one of their fingers and turned it into a necklace that he wore around his neck. Angulimala. So he was, finger necklace is what it literally means. A murderous, bloody-handed, given to blows and violence, and merciless to all living beings. And he was terrorizing the countryside. The Buddha knew of this murderer, robber, and set out one day to meet him. He was warned by people that he met not to do it, that he was dangerous, and yet he wanted to go forward. So the Buddha often has magical skills in these texts, and he came in sight of this Angulimala, and the robber thought, oh, fate has delivered me another person here. I'm going to kill this guy. And he decided he grabbed his sword and his shield and he went running up to catch him. And the Buddha kept going forward at his walking pace, and through this magical property, no matter how fast Angulimala ran, he could not get any closer to the Buddha, who was walking at a regular pace. He was unable to catch up with the Blessed One, who was walking at his normal pace. And Angulimala thought, whoa, this is great, this is marvelous, what the heck is happening here? I used to catch up with a galloping elephant and seize it, or a galloping horse, or a chariot, or a deer. But although I'm going as fast as I can, I'm unable to catch up with this monk. So his curiosity was piqued, not afraid.
That elephant's worked. It doesn't work. Okay. Yeah, that elephant's worked.
Could you mute your Zoom, please? Thank you. So he decided, I'm going to talk to this guy and see what's going on. So he calls out, "Stop, monk." And the Buddha replies, "I have stopped, Angulimala. Do you stop also?" And he thought, what the heck? I'm running fast and he's walking. Neither of us has stopped. What's going on here? What's he even talking about? But he also thought, these monks, these Sakyans, are known for speaking the truth. But I don't understand this. Suppose I talk to him and see if he can explain this to me, what he's talking about. He says, while you are walking, monk, you tell me you've stopped, but now when I have stopped, you say I have not stopped. I ask you, what is the meaning of this? How is it that you have stopped and I have not? So he's trying to make sense of this situation. And the Buddha replies, Angulimala, I have stopped forever for swearing violence to every living being, but you have no restraint toward anything. So that is why I have stopped and you have not. And Angulimala is really struck by this. I imagine that the Buddha had a presence that was being communicated to him very deeply. And he says these words and they stopped him in his tracks. He says, oh, at long last, a sage I can revere. He's looking for someone who will tell him what life like it is. You know, he's not afraid of him. He's not saying you shouldn't be killing people, you should do this or that. He's saying, you haven't stopped, and I have. It's as though Angulimala feels seen for the first time, and that power in being seen is enough to shake him to his core. And he decides right then and there to throw away his sword and his shield and to follow this enlightened person, and he senses there's something here that I want to know. It reminds me of the first time that I heard the 5 remembrances. They are, everyone gets sick, everyone gets old, everyone dies. You're going to be separated from everything that you love and hold dear, and that your deeds are the companion along the way. And when I heard that, I thought, oh my gosh, it's such a relief. Someone is finally saying it like it is. And I imagine that this is the kind of experience that Angulimala had, and was powerful enough to say, I'm just going to follow this guy now. So he asked to become a monk, and the Buddha accepted him, and then he became the Buddha's attendant for a while. So the Buddha was traveling, they went then to Savatthi, and Angulimala attended the Buddha, so got to live in close proximity to him for a while. Angulimala's story has little vignettes in it. So the first vignette is he meets the Buddha and he becomes a disciple. And then the next little scene that is shared in his story is a meeting with a local king. So they arrive at Savatthi, and as is the custom, people come to hear the Buddha's teachings, and one of the local kings comes, and the Buddha recognizes that he's agitated and disturbed, and he said, what's wrong? And he said, well, there's this terrible murderer and thief ravaging the countryside, and it's deeply disturbing. His name is Finger Necklace, Angulimala. And he said, I won't ever be able to put him down. We can't catch him. And the Buddha says, well, what would you do if this was no longer a problem? What would you do if this person had shaved off their head, the hair on their head, and put on the robe and become a monk, living this holy life? What would you do to him then? And the king says, I would pay homage to this guy. I would offer to help him. I would give him food and clothing to support his practice. And the king said, well, here he is, right here. Here's Angulimala. And the king automatically has this major fear response. He starts sweating and shaking. He's really nervous, shocked and alarmed, and his hair stood on end. And the Buddha saw this and he said, don't be afraid. There's nothing to fear. And again, it strikes me about this presence that the Buddha must have had to be able to, through the words, yes, but through his being, calm this person who's in fear of this, what he thought was probably not an invented word yet, but a psychopath who is now living with the Buddha. And then the king recognizes that Angulimala is there, and he makes good on his promise, and he offers to give support to Angulimala's practice, but also recognizes that he was from a family with high status originally, and offers to acknowledge his previous social status. But Angulimala responds by saying, "Thank you, but no, I'm practicing this life that I have taken up, and I'm satisfied with what I have right now, and I'm going to work with that." The king is happy that, and in awe actually, that what they were not able to do by force, the Buddha has been able to do peacefully, and he leaves. So that it sort of ends that vignette. And then Angulimala continues to practice. He's practicing out in the forest. He's meditating, he's sharing companionship with the other monks, and he's developing spiritually. He's developing to the point where he no longer is got this, desire to have what he wants to the point of exclusion, of, death of others. He's beginning to feel compassion for other people. And one day he goes to the marketplace and he sees a woman who's in distress, and she has a handicapped child as well. And his heart just really goes out to the suffering that this woman and the child are living. He thinks, oh, what defiled creatures, how they are suffering. And he goes to the Buddha and he tells him this. And the Buddha is maybe testing him a little bit. And he says to him, "Go back to Savatthi and say to the woman, 'Sister, since I was born, I have never purposely taken a living being's life. And by saying that truth, by that truth, may you and your child have peace.' So I've never taken anyone's life, and by the truth in that, may you have peace." And Angulimala is shocked, and he says, "But that would be lying, right? I'd be breaking the precepts. How can I do that? I have purposely taken the lives of many beings." And the Buddha says, "Okay, then say instead, since I was born with the noble birth, I have never purposely taken a living being's life. Since I came to this practice, I have never purposely taken a living being's life. And by that truth, may you and the child find peace." And he says, "Okay, I can do that. That's true. I can be in alignment with that." And so he goes back into the village, and he finds her, and he says this, "Sister, since I was born with the noble birth, I have never purposely taken a living being's life. By that truth, may you and the child have peace." And the woman and the child had peace. So in a similar way that the Buddha was able to transmit confidence and to transmit acceptance to Angulimala and to the king, by being in alignment with his own truth, he was able to give that as a gift to this woman who needed his compassion. And it was only then, after he was in alignment with who he was and what he had done and who he was now, that he was able to meditate deeply and ultimately have the insight he needed to become an arahat. So it says, then dwelling alone, withdrawn, diligent, ardent, and self-controlled, the venerable Angulimala, by realizing himself with direct knowledge, here and now, entered and dwelt in that supreme goal of the holy life. He knew directly, birth is ended, exhausted, the holy life has been lived. So he had this realization of suffering, and that suffering can end, and he experienced it for himself. But this isn't the story, the end of the story of Angulimala, which I find very interesting. One day, he had become an arahat. He had had deep realizations. He had changed completely from a murderer and a robber into someone who was deeply compassionate, both for himself and other people. And he went into the village to beg for food, as they did in the morning. And some of the villagers saw him and recognized him, and they started throwing dirt at him and sticks and stones, and they fell upon him and beat him up and broke his food bowl. And he went back to his home, to where he lived, and with his head broken, blood flowing, his bowl in pieces, his outer robe of patches torn. And he went to the Buddha, and seeing him coming, the Buddha said, "Bear it, Brahman, bear it. You have experienced here and now in this life the ripening of deeds." So he had changed completely, and yet he still was responsible. He still had the karma, we would say, to work through of what he had done. When he was alone in retreat, he wrote a poem, which I'll read to you at the very end, some of it, but he didn't feel sorry for himself, and he didn't feel anger at others. He wished them that their acts of violence would be helpful for them to awaken as well. So it's like the chant that we chant. Who is that? Huh?
It's one of them.
Yep, we'll come with it. I'll think of the name of who it was. Anyway, so that's how the story ends. The last vignette is that he is still responsible for what he had done and for the impact, for the fruition of the negative acts which he put out into the world. Shanti Deva, yes, thank you. So as I've been going through these stories on the Buddha's life, I've been thinking a little bit about stories and how they affect me as I've been learning this, and that they're not just independent, isolated stories. They're really an interaction between the listener and the words. And we draw meaning through our interaction with the words of the story. What resonates, what feelings arise, what confusion or what's disturbing about the story. And it's through this interaction that the meaning starts to come out. So as I was going through this story, what came out for me, it's got, these 4 parts. What sort of themes popped out, or what became particularly meaningful for me? I'll share that with you. And then at the end, if you have found something particularly touching or intriguing or confusing, I'd be interested to know like what your experience with this particular story. I mean, it's quite dramatic of such a reviled character turning over, changing so incredibly, and then then living his life. So I mentioned before this idea that so much more is shared than the words alone came across in the story, both in the Buddha's impact on Angulimala, how he was able to calm the king who was having a panic attack when he realized he had this terrible murderer sitting right in front of him, and even the way that Angulimala was able to share his blessings with this woman and her child. Like what is that is transmitted from person to person that is beyond the words? It reminded me of a story of our teacher, Chosen's teacher, Maizumi Roshi. When he first met his teacher, he saw this priest riding on a bus, and he was so taken by how he was sitting on the bus, that he got up off the bus and followed him and met him and then became a student. This alignment that is so powerful that the Buddha experienced and that Angulimala experienced as well, and that we are all capable of. The other thing that I found interesting is the power of speaking the language of the heart. So the Buddha didn't say, you should stop murdering all these people because you're breaking the precepts. He spoke directly to him. I've stopped. Why haven't you stopped? You haven't stopped. Just that speaking directly, not about the circumstances that were occurring, stopped him and really shook him. I thought it was also really interesting, almost like how Angulimala was tested a couple of times. So the king says, I'll give you, I'll acknowledge you, I'll support you. And it's almost like being tested of, you can step back into the community and people will give you your place that you were born into, and you can have money. It's like the lure of fame and gain, the worldly wins. And he says, no, I'm gonna keep on this path that I'm on and continue. I have enough. In another story of Angulimala in a later text, it talked about how he was having so much trouble with his meditation practice because he couldn't forgive himself. And that just seems very likely if you killed people and cut their fingers off and wore them on your neck to intimidate others. Forgiving yourself for that would be difficult. And it was after this act of compassion to the woman, after only being able to tell her what was true for himself and not misrepresenting himself in any way, this alignment, that he was able to forgive himself enough to then settle in and be a vessel for this realization that he ultimately had. And then finally, this karma, this planting a seed by practicing sincerely, and over time he planted positive seeds so that he was able to grow and develop into a compassionate, realized person. But he also was responsible for what he had done previously and had to live with the consequences of that in this lifetime and in this, in the way that the Theravadins see this throughout other lifetimes. In fact, the Buddha said, Bharat, you have experienced here and now in this life the ripening of deeds whose ripening you might have experienced in hell over many a year, many a century, and many a millennium. So he was burning off his karma by accepting, by allowing this without falling back into hate and blame. So then here's, in these stories, they often break into poetry. And so here's part of the poem that's attributed to Angulimala. When once did I live in recklessness, and then in recklessness nevermore. Who once did live in recklessness, and then in recklessness nevermore, shall light the world like the full moon when clouds unmask it. Who checks with wholesome deeds the evil deeds already done, shall light the world like the full moon when clouds unmask it. Who, as a useful bhikkhu, shows devotion to the Buddha's Dharma, shall light the world like the full moon when clouds unmask it. Innocent is the name I bear, who was obnoxious in the past. The name I bear today is true. I hurt not anyone at all. And though I once lived as a robber with the name of Finger Necklace, and whom the great flood swept along, I went for refuge to the Buddha, and though I was once bloody-handed with the name of Finger Necklace, see now the refuge I have found. What leads to rebirth is no more, whilst I did many deeds that promised birth in unhappy destinations, yet the results has reached me now, and so I eat no more in debt. So, happy ending for Angulimala. So before we end with the 4 great bodhisattva vows, does anyone have any thoughts or comments about that interesting story from the life of the Buddha? Yeah?
I write a lot of letters with prisoners, and there's a lot of hopelessness and a feeling that they're beyond redemption. And that's actually a nice story to convey to them. What's the name of the author?
Bhikkhu Nanamoli. But if you go to Access to Insight, that's a website that has all of the suttas that these were collected from. You could also just put in, like, probably Finger Necklace or, Angulimala, and get it that way. Yeah. Terry.
I think the most striking thing about that story to me is how he's attacked by the villagers, and Buddha says, bear it, Brahmin, and then he talks about his deeds from, his past lives, basically surfacing. And so, makes me think, okay, so when, I'm suffering, or when things happen in people's lives, how do they apply that, I suppose in a way it could be somewhat helpful, and in a way it could be totally unhelpful.
I don't think he's saying allow yourself to be abused, right? I think he's saying, how he reacted was by not falling into old habit patterns of feeling angry or vindictive, but still felt compassion for the people who were doing that. I think it's about meeting the circumstances that are before you appropriately. And in this situation, it was appropriate for him not to fight back. That wouldn't have been helpful given who he was and what he had done. But it doesn't mean in other circumstances that appropriate response would be to do nothing.
I mean, there's a lot packed into this. You know, I think it's something that is worth thinking about, processing the whole story over some time. Thank you.
Thank you.